Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Good Lawyers Gone Bad podcast. My name is Stuart. Today, we've got an interesting story about an interesting politician. What really turned Rudy Giuliani into a psycho? You're going to find out during this episode of the Good Lawyers Gone Bad podcast. I hope you enjoy the podcast. I hope you will like and comment on the podcast. Please go ahead and rate it on your favorite podcasting platform of choice. It would be very helpful to us. So enjoy this story, the rise and fall of Rudy Giuliani. My mother is as Brooklyn as you can get. She's been out of the city for decades. I mean, it's been decades since she's lived in Brooklyn, but it's in her soul. You know what she's like? I'm convinced that my mother is the impetus for the character of Howard Wolowitz's mother on The Big Bang Theory. You know that woman? Howard, come downstairs! I swear to you, that's my mother. I swear it. My mother had a variety of ways that she liked to torture me as a child. One of them was clothing. Oh yeah, every single school picture I have from 1978 until 1982, I am wearing a velour shirt. Not the same velour shirt. Oh, no, I'm not wearing the same velour shirt in every picture. I had an assortment of velour shirts to choose from. I had burgundy velour. I had turquoise velour. I had a V-neck. I had one with a pop collar, some with snaps on it. I had all different kinds of velour shirts. And I asked her, Ma, why did you put me in a velour shirt every single picture? She says, it's velour. It's soft. Who doesn't like velour? Girls, Ma, all of them, from the beginning of time until now, do not like velour shirts. I have no idea how I eventually got married. The other way that my mother liked to torture me is that she sent me to Hebrew school until I graduated from public high school. I mean, lots of my friends went to religious school locally. I had friends who went to catechism. I had friends who went to Hebrew school locally. No, my mother made me get on a bus and schlep into Manhattan to 123rd Street and Amsterdam Avenue to the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, the place where they ordain rabbis. Why? Because my mother is a psychopath. I remember I was in a convention once and I told someone about that. And the next morning, the person I had been speaking to was introducing me to someone else. And they said, oh, this is Stuart. He's the rabbi. Yeah. If you knew how many classes I cut, you would know that there is no way I could be a rabbi. Just in case you ever find yourself going to school at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America on 123rd Street, you should understand that Grant's tomb is only a couple of blocks away. And it's a great place to sit and hide if you want to cut classes. By the way, this is going to be a great test about whether my mother actually listens to my podcast because I've never told her that, and she will still be mad at me if she finds out. If I skip the next podcast episode, it's mostly because at almost 60 years old, I was grounded. All of us who went to this program would get on a bus in Jersey and take it into the city, and the same guy drove the bus for us every week. His name was Joe. And to this day, I remember him. He was about 6'2", and he had sort of wavy blonde hair. It was almost like a wavy blonde afro of sorts. You know, now that I think about it, I think he might have had like a loose perm, you know? It was like kind of poofy on the top and long in the back. Anyway, Joe would take us back to Jersey through the Lincoln Tunnel. He would come from uptown, and then he'd head down to the Lincoln Tunnel and he'd take the route that led behind the Port Authority bus terminal on 42nd Street. And we'd get to a sort of windy area by 9th Avenue. And then there was a service road. And eventually we'd get into the tunnel. But what I remember the most about that trip is that right around 42nd Street, just before we got into the actual tunnel tube, there was an area that could have come out of a photojournalist's portfolio of gritty 1970 and 1980s New York. The street was lined with prostitutes. It looked like the opening credits to a New York cop show from the late 70s. It was a small back street, so we went slow, and there was a traffic light at the corner, which we sometimes got stopped at. So from the bus, we had a perfect view of what was going on. We would all gather at the side of the bus, pressing our faces against the windows, trying to get a look at all of it. You could see the classic type of situations. A woman was leaning into the passenger side window of a car, talking to a prospective John in the driver's seat. There was a bunch of buses parked on the side of the road, and if you looked inside the driver's window of the bus, you'd see two people in that seat. That was the New York I remembered as a kid. I've always felt that 42nd Street in New York City was one of the 3 levels of debauchery in the 1980s. Vegas is where a guy went and ended up having a good time. New Orleans is where a guy went and ended up with a divorce. And 42nd Street is where a guy went and ended up with a venereal disease. I mean, it was that bad. When you walk down 42nd Street today, you're in a different world. Today, on that once notorious stretch of road, you'll find family-friendly theaters, people dressed as Disney characters taking photos with tourists, and, other kitschy things like souvenir shops. And the person who made it that way was Rudy Giuliani. Having children can be an agonizing experience. I mean, you try to steer them in the right direction. You say, listen, I've lived more life than you have. I've made a lot of mistakes. I've stepped on landmines that have left me scarred, and I've stepped in some piles of crap that were just uncomfortable. But whether the damage was long-lasting or just an inconvenience, I want to tell you about it so it doesn't happen to you. Here, you tell them, here is how to avoid those unpleasant parts of life. And then your kids ignore you, they make their own mistakes, and then they end up saying the same thing to their kids who ignore them, and the cycle continues. But you try. You try to give them the guidance they need. Rudy Giuliani's father did the same thing. The difference was, Rudy's father wasn't completely honest. The playwright Neil Simon could have created Rudy Giuliani's childhood. I know, Neil Simon was Jewish. Biloxi Blues, Brighton Beach Memoirs, yeah, I know. But Jews and Italians were like photo negatives of each other. They say yo, we say oi. Y-O, O-Y. It's basically the same thing. Rudolph William Louis Giuliani was born on May 28, 1944 in Brooklyn, New York. His upbringing was truly stereotypical for the time. He had a large Italian family, and most of his relatives were cops and firefighters. He once said, quote, I grew up with uniforms all around me and their stories of heroism. Oh yeah, stories. He was told some stories. The Giuliani family didn't stay in Brooklyn for long, though. When he was 7 years old, his parents, Harold and Helen Giuliani, moved their family east to Long Island. As a young person in the suburbs, Rudy was taught about respect and law and order by his father. His father ingrained these ideas into young Rudy's psyche. Harold Giuliani would drill the idea of respecting authority into his young son's head, and the repeated lessons would stick so thoroughly that it would become the bedrock principle that guided Rudolph Giuliani throughout much of his career. But at the time, Rudy the youngster didn't realize that he was being lied to. His parents didn't tell him the real reason they moved to Long Island. The real reason for getting out of Brooklyn was to try to save their young son from the life that his father had fallen into. Yeah, it seems that all of those people in uniforms who surrounded young Rudy Giuliani, well, they were only half of his family's story. The other half was exactly what you'd expect from the stereotype. And it was right under his roof. Rudy's father worked for his brother's mafia-connected loan sharking business, and apparently he was a bit of a thug. He was once arrested for robbing a milkman at gunpoint and spent 1.5 years in jail. The parents' goal, it seems, was to get Rudy out of Dodge so he wouldn't follow in his father's footsteps and turn into just another outlaw. You want to hear something incredible? Rudy didn't learn that fact about his father's history until a reporter unearthed the story 70 years later in 2020. Regardless, the lessons that Rudy's parents taught him about law and order stuck. Rudy Giuliani went to a Catholic high school and then on to Manhattan College, which at the time was an all-boys Catholic college, and then he went to New York University where he got his law degree. Giuliani went from law school straight to government service. After NYU, Rudy got a prestigious federal clerkship with a judge in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, that's Manhattan. And after that, he moved to Washington, D.C. to work for the U.S. Attorney's Office. His ascent up the ladder was swift. In 1975, he was appointed as President Gerald Ford's Deputy Associate Attorney General. He then went into private practice for about 5 years or so, but he returned to the Justice Department as an Associate Attorney General. In 1983, he had his big moment. Ronald Reagan appointed Rudy Giuliani to be U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. And that is when the legend was born. Giuliani's office launched a series of high-profile investigations targeting mob families in New York. He led the prosecution of several top mafia captains, including members of the notorious Gambino and Genovese crime families. He helped bring down powerful bosses like John Gotti. And that one in particular was a big part of creating the Giuliani brand. Gotti was infamously acquitted twice before Giuliani's team secured a conviction. Rudy's efforts in dismantling the mafia were highly publicized, and his tough, no-nonsense image resonated with the public and helped cement his reputation as a fierce opponent of organized crime. The path that was carved by Rudy Giuliani's father years ago had come to fruition. Getting the young boy out of Brooklyn and pointing him in the direction of law and order had been successful. But Rudy's father, he never saw that success. Rudy Giuliani's father died of prostate cancer in 1981, only 2 years before he was appointed to be U.S. Attorney. But did Rudy really take that path because his father pushed him in that direction? Is that what genuinely motivated Rudy Giuliani to become a mob buster? I mean, it seems like almost too easy of an explanation. Italian-American boy who comes from a neighborhood where everybody is either a gangster or a cop, during an era where the mob is an integral part of the community, is taken out of the tough neighborhood by his parents and then devotes his life to busting the mafia. Really? If you tried to sell that story to Hollywood, they'd throw your cliché-drenched behind right out on the street. Well, if it seems like too easy of an explanation, it's because it probably is too easy of an explanation. I don't think Rudy's goal in life was to be a mob buster. Being a cutthroat prosecutor wasn't what he aspired to be. It was the role he had to play. That job was a vehicle. It was a vehicle he rode towards pursuing his true goal. A goal that would consume his life and contribute to the downfall we see today. Oh yeah, there was a lot more going inside Rudy Giuliani's head, and it started back when he was in high school. Every younger generation thinks they invented being young. Right? Every younger generation thinks they invented rebelliousness. Like they are the first generation who wanted to be different from their parents. It's almost comical. Yeah, you're the first generation to think about the world differently from the older people around you. But there actually was something different about the younger generation in the early 60s. For that generation, there genuinely was something unique happening. The outgoing president of the United States in 1959 was Dwight Eisenhower. He was an old man who was best known for being a general during World War II. And it wasn't just Ike. All of the presidents before him were basically old men. The person who hoped to succeed Eisenhower, however, was so different that he captivated a generation of young people in a way that hadn't been seen, well, maybe ever. John F. Kennedy was riveting. He was young, handsome, rich, articulate, and that probably would have been enough to fascinate and attract a young Rudy Giuliani. But that wasn't all he was. There was one more characteristic about John F. Kennedy that sealed the deal for Rudy. John F. Kennedy was Catholic. Oh yeah, that was a big deal for Rudy. Truth is, it was a big deal for a lot of people back then. Some people were thrilled, some people were infuriated, but it was a big deal. Back then, Catholics were still seen by many as outsiders. The only Catholic to ever run for president before JFK was Al Smith in 1928, and he got crushed. Many people believe that it was partly because of anti-Catholic sentiment. The fear was that a Catholic president would take orders from the Pope in Rome and that would undermine U.S. sovereignty. The concern about JFK was confirmed in the polls. History may have canonized John F. Kennedy today, but in 1960, he won by the slimmest of margins. There were 69 million votes cast, and John F. Kennedy won by a total of 118,000. But he won. And when John F. Kennedy, an Irish Catholic, was successful in obtaining the country's highest office, Rudolph Giuliani, an Italian Catholic, began to think that anything was possible. People think that Rudy Giuliani was motivated throughout his career by the pursuit of law and order. No, that wasn't it. Rudy Giuliani was motivated throughout his career by the pursuit of the White House. His obsession with becoming president of the United States started a day in high school when young Rudy Giuliani saw John F. Kennedy on the campaign trail. When Rudy saw JFK, he was bit by the bug. He went back to high school and started showing a serious interest in politics. By the time he got to college, his drive was well established. The news outlet Salon once reported that Rudy's college girlfriend knew that Rudy Giuliani had eyes on the presidency from a young age. She once said, chuckling, "We'd joke about it. Oh, there's Rudolph William Louis Giuliani III, the first Italian Catholic president of the United States." She went on to say that he'd said it enough that it was part of him. And she recalled that he didn't say things lightly. Rudy's ambition was budding. He became sophomore class president at Manhattan College in 1961 and president of his college fraternity. You see, being a tough prosecutor was not Rudolph Giuliani's goal. It was a stepping stone. And that's why, when he was done busting mafia captains, he moved on. To use the language of the people he targeted, Rudy Giuliani didn't want to be a consigliere. He wanted to be the boss. There are a variety of paths someone can take to get to the White House. Dwight Eisenhower became a military hero. John F. Kennedy used his dynastic and wealthy family to propel him to office. But being a mayor? Being the mayor of a municipality isn't usually a springboard to the White House. Of course, that calculation changes dramatically if you're the mayor of the most famous city in the world. Rudy Giuliani played his card as prosecutor as far as it could take him. There was no one bigger for him to take down, so becoming mayor of New York City was the next logical step in his walk towards the White House. But there would be a bump in the road. David Dinkins was, by political standards, a relatively soft-spoken man who just seemed qualified and nice. He seemed like a guy who could handle the job of mayor of New York, and he was generally liked. On top of that, with Dinkins, there was an opportunity for the Big Apple to make a big statement. If Dinkins were elected, he would be the city's first black mayor. In 1989, Rudy Giuliani ran for mayor of New York City as a Republican against Democrat David Dinkins. Rudy lost by a razor-thin margin in one of the closest mayoral elections in New York City history. But instead of recalibrating his path to the White House, Rudy waited. And he watched. And over the next 4 years, Rudy saw the Dinkins administration implode. By the time Mayor Dinkins was up for re-election, the city was in a desperate state. More than 1 million New Yorkers were on welfare, crime rates were skyrocketing, and an ever-worsening crack cocaine epidemic was plaguing neighborhoods throughout the city. In 1993, Rudy challenged David Dinkins again. This time, many New Yorkers believed that a tough-on-crime prosecutor was exactly what the city needed, and Rudy won. When Rudy took office, he was anointed as the savior of New York City, and he did not disappoint his disciples. Rudy cleaned up 42nd Street, famously getting rid of the sex shops that lined the road. He improved the quality of life throughout the city. He eliminated the squeegee men who harassed drivers for money, and he cleaned up the subways so it didn't feel like strap hangers were descending down into the depths of hell when getting on public transportation. Rudy was a mayoral god. But as is true with many gods, there were non-believers. And when it came to Rudy Giuliani, those non-believers were angry, vocal, and had some good points. Rudy relied on a particular theory to fix the crime problem in New York. It was called the broken windows theory. It's an idea that was developed by James Q. Wilson and George L. Kelling in a 1982 article published in The Atlantic. The theory argued that visible signs of disorder, like broken windows, graffiti, and public loitering, all of those encourage more serious crime by creating an environment of lawlessness. The idea was that addressing minor offenses could prevent larger crimes from occurring. It basically held that if one focused more on quality of life crimes like jaywalking, public drinking, and turnstile jumping, then the overall epidemic of crime in the city would turn around. The broken windows theory was the backbone of Rudy's crime-fighting efforts. The proponents of Rudy's approach said it worked. The critics said that the enforcement of the broken windows theory disproportionately targeted people of color. Rudy's critics, however, were sidelined. Actually, they were steamrolled because he was getting the job done. Within 2 years, there was a 30% drop in serious crime and the murder rate was cut in half. City schools were improving and so was the quality of life in the city. People who were pointing out the inequities of the approach were largely ignored regardless of the merit of their positions. And in 1997, Rudolph Giuliani won re-election by a landslide. In February of 1999, 4 undercover police officers from the NYPD Street Crime Unit were riding in an unmarked car in the Soundview section of the Bronx. They were on the lookout for a rape suspect. The guy they were looking for was believed to be responsible for over 50 attacks, and word on the street was that he was in the area and armed. The cops came up to an apartment building on Wheeler Avenue and found a guy peering into the windows of that building. It looked suspicious. Suspicious enough to investigate. 2 of the officers hopped out of the car to question the man. They approached him with caution. If this was their man, he'd likely be armed. As they got closer, the cops identified themselves as police officers, and when they did, the suspect took off running toward the door of the building. The cops chased him, surely figuring that they'd found their man. They were partially right. They'd found a man, just not their man. Amadou Diallo was an immigrant from the West African country of Guinea. He was a street vendor who sold gloves and socks on the streets of Manhattan. Diallo was looking into the window of his apartment building when he heard police officers. He got scared and ran toward the vestibule of the apartment building where he lived, seeking safety. But to the police officers, he looked like a criminal who was trying to flee. Diallo pushed through the first set of doors and made it into the vestibule of his apartment building. One of the officers was pursuing him, and he was only a couple of feet away. The cop demanded that the suspect show his hands and come out. Diallo reached into his pocket. The cop saw Diallo reaching into his pocket and saw him pull out something black. The cop instinctively shouted, "Gun!" and all hell broke loose. That cop closest to Diallo shot him 3 times, and in the melee, the officer fell backwards down the few steps that led up to the front door. As the cop hit the ground, his fellow officers thought their colleague had been shot, so they shot at the suspect, some emptying the clips of their guns. When it was over, Amadou Diallo was struck 19 times, and he was killed instantly. When the officers searched his body to retrieve the gun, they learned that Diallo was actually reaching for his wallet. He was unarmed. The shooting of Amadou Diallo came on the heels of another horrific incident involving New York City police officers. During the early morning hours of August 9, 1997, Haitian immigrant Abner Louima was arrested after he left Club Rendezvous on Flatbush Avenue in Brooklyn. He was handcuffed, placed in the rear of a patrol car, and transported to the 70th Precinct. Louima said that on the way to the precinct, the police officers transporting him stopped the car twice and beat him. When they got to the station, Louima was taken into a bathroom where he was brutally assaulted by an NYPD police officer. The cop shoved a stick into Louima's rectum, and he did it with so much force that it tore through Louima's internal organs. Critics of the Giuliani administration were not surprised by these events. They'd been arguing for some time that the mayor's pursuit of law and order had bordered on ruthlessness, and these incidents, they claimed, were the proof. For Rudy Giuliani, the tide was shifting. The gains he made cleaning up the city were at risk of being eclipsed by the disasters that were happening on his watch. But he probably didn't care that much. And that's because Rudy wasn't planning on hanging around New York City for much longer. One reason for that was because he couldn't run for mayor again. There were term limits on being mayor of New York City, but forget that. Rudy didn't even think that he was going to finish his second term as mayor. Oh yeah, Rudy was done with New York City. He got what he needed. The objective in being mayor was to develop a reputation as a serious politician who was tough as nails and could get stuff done. He did that. So it was time for him to move on. But he wasn't going to wait until his term was over to continue his trek toward the White House. That's because the next step in that direction opened up while he was still mayor. I got a hot take for you. You ready? Here's my hot take. The new Moynihan Train Hall in New York City is the stupidest building in Manhattan. It is the stupidest development project in New York City, second only to Hudson Yards. Do not get me started on Hudson Yards. It is the worst redevelopment project in the history of New York City. It is horrendous. I'm going to do an entire program on why I hate Hudson Yards. It's going to have nothing to do with lawyers, but I need to get it off my chest. Okay, let's put Hudson Yards aside for a moment and get back to the ridiculousness that is the Moynihan Train Hall. It was such a waste of money, it's incredible. Nobody from New York uses it. First of all, there's no subway access. Secondly, its location is ridiculous. It's on the other side of Madison Square Garden between 8th and 9th Avenues. So if you're coming from the east, which most people are, you need to pass Penn Station, pass Madison Square Garden, cross 8th Avenue, and then go into the train hall. There's no reason to do that. You can just go into Penn Station on 7th Avenue and get the train from there. All of the train tracks run underneath both buildings, so you can get all the trains you need in Penn Station. Now, granted, Penn Station is disgusting. Penn Station is disgusting, and the Moynihan Train Hall is new and clean. But that's not enough to justify a longer walk from 7th to 8th Avenue for New Yorkers. The only people who use Moynihan Train Hall are tourists or New Yorkers who get off a train, walk up the stairs, and realize, I ended up all the way over in this place. Now I'm going to miss my bus. The building was a waste of money. The structure is named after Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who served as the United States Senator from New York for 4 terms. Pat Moynihan was an institution in New York, and when he announced that he would not be seeking re-election just before the year 2000, lots of serious people were ready to grab his seat. This was Rudy Giuliani's next step. Becoming a U.S. Senator was the bridge he needed to walk across that led to a run for the White House. You cannot put too much significance on this opportunity. It was that big to Rudy. But it wouldn't be a cakewalk, because there was another politician standing in his way. And it was a person who was related to someone sort of like Rudy, a person who was moved into politics by meeting John F. Kennedy when he was just a youngster. Bill Clinton was famously driven into politics after having met John F. Kennedy as a kid. There's a famous picture of Clinton shaking JFK's hand that was a big part of Clinton's campaign for the presidency. Do you remember Bill Clinton's famous line? The one he said all the time, the one they made fun of him about? "I'll feel your pain." You remember that? They made fun of it on Saturday Night Live. "I'll feel your pain." He said it all the time. It was his way of being empathetic, but it became the thing of parody. Well, there was one person feeling the pain a little bit more than others. The person feeling the most pain during the Clinton administration was Hillary. And it wasn't just because of the awful things her husband was caught doing with interns. No, Hillary was feeling the pain because she was being held back. Assuming the subordinate role of First Lady was not in Hillary Rodham Clinton's nature. And you don't have to take my word for it. You should take her word for it. She famously explained that when her husband pursued a job in government, she could have stayed home and baked cookies. But instead, she decided to, as she put it, fulfill her profession, which she embarked upon before her husband was in public life. The press skewered her for those remarks. But in doing so, they were ignoring the deeper message she was trying to convey. Hillary wasn't trying to insult other women. She was expressing her own personal frustration. What she was saying was, "I am qualified to be a politician, and I am frustrated with having to play the role of First Lady, and I'd like to have an opportunity to show what I've got." So when Patrick Moynihan's Senate seat was up, Hillary Clinton was there to throw her hat into the ring. This was going to be a spectacular race. Two of the most famous people in the country would be going at it. Hillary Clinton, the wife of the President of the United States, would be squaring off against Rudy Giuliani, America's mayor. The prize would be the Senate seat of one of the most influential states in the Union. The press was licking its chops. This race would surely dominate the news cycle in 2000. But just as the political pundits and journalists settled in for a wild ride, the roller coaster came to a halt. It was over before it started. In April of 2000, Rudy Giuliani was diagnosed with prostate cancer, the same disease that killed his father almost 20 years before. He was forced to bow out of the race. I think when this happened, something splintered in Rudolph Giuliani's mind. I don't mean that he had a nervous breakdown. I mean that there was a scary realization that crept into his mind. Think about it. There are not that many avenues to the White House. Senate seats don't open up every day. There's actually a very slim chance that a viable path will emerge for any person. Rudy's entire life was dedicated toward the pursuit of the presidency. A run for the Senate seat was one of the most valuable opportunities he would see in his lifetime. And when that was extinguished, I think something inside of him broke. He must have sensed that his dream was in serious jeopardy, and a sense of desperation simply had to creep into his brain. It was like a small mental crack existed that no one saw at the moment. A small splintering of his psyche that would grow over time. But for now, Rudy only had one choice: go back to New York City and ride out the rest of his term. While Rudy Giuliani was returning to City Hall in New York to serve out the remainder of his term as mayor, I was working as in-house counsel for a real estate developer. One morning, I was driving to one of our projects in Newburgh, New York with my boss. The radio was off in the car, and we were talking about work stuff the whole way up. This was about 6 years before the first iPhone would be released, which meant that no one was constantly checking the chatter on the internet by way of a supercomputer we each carried around in our pocket. When we arrived at our destination, we hopped out of the car and walked into the office. It was surprisingly empty. None of the staff were at their desks. We walked through the office searching for a sign of life, and we found everyone jammed into one office in the back. The entire staff was huddled around a small television set, and no one was uttering a word. The look of silent horror on their faces was something I will never forget. I peeked over their shoulders at the television screen to see what they were all fixated on, and that was the first time I saw the image of the Twin Towers burning. Everyone who's old enough to have a memory of September 11th can tell you where they were and what they were doing when they first saw, heard, or experienced 9/11. Those of us who are from the New York metropolitan area are all either related to or know someone who perished that day. The entire nation was in shock as we watched the towers burn and fall. The confusion and the helplessness that people felt while looking at the piles of rubble in downtown Manhattan was paralyzing. And as the country struggled to deal with what was happening, Rudolph Giuliani emerged from the rubble. Rudy got to ground zero within minutes of the second plane crash. When he got there, he hit the ground running. He coordinated rescue operations and became the national voice of reassurance and consolation. He assured listeners from all across the globe. He said, "Tomorrow, New York is going to be here, and we are going to rebuild, and we're going to be stronger than we were before." He reassured everyone by saying, "I want the people of New York to be an example to the rest of the country and the rest of the world that terrorism can't stop us." Giuliani's leadership during the city's moment of crisis was so inspirational that New York Magazine created an edition with a special cover. It contained a caricature of Rudy Giuliani wearing an outfit reminiscent of the World War II posters of Uncle Sam, complete with a star-spangled top hat and a headline that read, "I want you to save New York City." Any critics of Rudy Giuliani's work during his term as mayor were silenced. He was elevated to mythical status. Yes, to many in New York City, Rudy was still a problem, but their voices were basically diluted by the people who sang his praises. I think it was because the moment was overwhelming, and the country was looking for someone to follow through the danger and the worry and the anger. And Rudy was there to be that person. As the dust settled on ground zero and the country repaired its wounds, Rudy Giuliani found himself at a difficult crossroad. He was done with his term as mayor. And yes, he was among the most famous politicians in the world. But what good was it? What good is it to be considered a political god if you had no way to use that reputation to obtain higher office? It was 2001, and there were no opportunities in front of him that led to the White House. There was simply no path available that would allow him to capitalize on his current reputation in a way that would lead him toward achieving that singular goal of his life. Think about it. George Bush was the president of the United States. He was a Republican who was elected only a year ago. That meant that he would be the presumptive nominee for the Republican Party when he ran for re-election in 2004. The opportunity to make a run for that office would have to wait. On the Senate side, there weren't any seats open. Hillary was elected also just a year earlier, and that was for a 6-year term. The other Senate seat was occupied by Chuck Schumer, who wasn't up for re-election for several years, and he was no pushover. Schumer was a political veteran in New York, and he'd be tough to beat. So despite his stellar worldwide reputation, Rudolph Giuliani had to be feeling a sense of panic. His popularity was at an all-time high, but his opportunities to seize the White House were at a dangerous low. That little splinter in his mind must have been growing. The voice of desperation was getting louder. As Rudy finished his term at City Hall in New York, he had no choice but to bide his time and ride the wave of his popularity until the next political opportunity rose. But he was going to have to ride that wave for a long time. And that meant that the chance he'd wipe out was pretty high. Since Rudy didn't have the opportunity to parlay his popularity into political success, he decided to pursue financial success. For Rudy, it was time to make some money. He started a consulting firm in 2002 called Giuliani Partners. He was smart. He capitalized on the reputation he'd built over the last few years. Giuliani Partners provided security and police training as well as political consultant services. The man definitely had valuable contacts, and his company grew into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Of course, there were some criticisms. He did a lot of work with Qatar, an oil-rich Middle Eastern nation believed to have ties to terrorist movements. Giuliani Partners also became involved in the pharmaceutical industry, specifically with Purdue Pharma. That's the company whose name is now synonymous with the opioid addiction controversy. As Rudy pursued that business, he was surely waiting for the next opportunity to arise that would take him to the White House. The opportunity didn't roll up for another 7 years. It wasn't until 2008 that Rudy got a chance to get back into the game. But when he did, he was in the mix for the job of his dreams. In 2008, Rudy Giuliani ran for the Republican Party nomination for President of the United States. This was his moment. His chance had finally come to ascend to the position that he always coveted. And his chances were good. Rudy entered the race as a favorite. His national polling numbers were looking great, and he had high name recognition. The race was his to lose. New York City is a very unique place. There's no place like it in the world. There's an electricity that runs through the entire city, and it runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In my opinion, the only time that hum silenced was during COVID. My son was living in the city that time, and I went to go visit him. It was the creepiest time to be in New York. I had never experienced silence in New York like I experienced during COVID. But with that exception, New York has a unique, constant energy. And the people are different too. You know, people think New Yorkers are mean, but they're not. I have what I think is the best definition of the personality of New Yorkers. New Yorkers mind their own business. They don't say hello while walking down the street or waiting for the bus, not because they're mean, but because they mind their own business. They don't ask you how your day is going or who you're rooting for in the Super Bowl, not because they're jerks. It's just that they mind their own business. If you need help, like serious help, they'll help you. You hurt yourself on the street, a New Yorker will stop to help. You lose your kid in the park, New Yorkers will help you find him. But if you don't need genuine help, they mind their own business. That's why so many celebrities love to live in New York City. People don't stop you on the street for a selfie. They mind their own business. New Yorkers are different from the rest of the world in that way. New Yorkers are different from the rest of America in that way. So what plays in New York doesn't always play elsewhere. There are different people with different values, and that's the problem that Rudy Giuliani ran into. When Rudy ran for the Republican nomination for the presidency, the national Republican electorate didn't find the brash, tough-on-crime, politically moderate Republican from New York nearly as endearing as they did when he was standing on top of heaps of rubble in Ground Zero. In fact, when they looked close during the primary, they didn't really like what they saw. Rudy had an affair when he was married. He was pro-choice. He favored gun control. Those stances played with New Yorkers, but they didn't impress Republicans in more conservative states. In fact, Rudy struggled to make connections with national Republican voters. And then, to make matters worse, he famously botched the primary election strategy. The disaster that was his primary campaign is probably taught as a case study for what not to do in political science classes today. Giuliani's team made the strategic decision to ignore early primaries in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. Instead, they bet it all on Florida. His campaign poured all their money into Florida, hoping a big win there would catapult him to Super Tuesday and ultimately the nomination. Well, as Election Day in the various states arrived and the results were delivered from all the primaries he ignored, Rudy Giuliani watched his lifelong dream slip away. The results from Iowa came in. Rudy got 3% of the vote. He finished 6th. Numbers like that probably made the splinter in his psyche advance to a healthy-sized crack. The results from New Hampshire came in. Rudy got 9% of the vote, and he finished fourth. The crack in his psyche was now a gash. Every time he thought about his floundering campaign, he must have started to breathe heavy, shaking his head in disgust. The results from South Carolina came in. Rudy got just over 2% of the vote and finished sixth. Imagine having to deliver those results to him. Watching him grimace, maybe beads of sweat gathering on his forehead. The rupture in his psyche must have been a full-blown chasm at this point. By the time Florida voted, Rudy had lost all momentum. He was basically irrelevant. He got 15% of the vote and finished a distant third. Rudy dropped out of the race the very next day. Rudy Giuliani's political career was over, and he knew it. His miscalculations ensured that he wouldn't have another opportunity to run as a serious primary candidate again. It was 2008, and all paths to the presidency were closed. The goal he pursued his entire life, the objective that started when he was a high school student in 1960, it would not be reached. He must have felt empty and devastated. His psyche must have been blown to shreds. He must have felt broken. What would he do now? Where would he turn? Rudy wandered aimlessly through both his professional and personal life. He went back to Giuliani Partners. He became a partner in a law firm. He thought about doing a radio show but changed his mind. He toyed with a run for governor of New York, but it never materialized. He passed on running for president in 2012. He surely was still stinging from the rejection of the Republican electorate, and he knew that he already spent the entirety of his political capital. And then he got divorced. Rudy Giuliani was circling the drain. And then someone reached out and extended a hand. Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani were both old-school New Yorkers. They'd known each other for years, and they were a lot alike. They both had a combative, law-and-order worldview. They used tough-on-crime rhetoric, and both were skeptical of political elites. And here was one more thing. They had a mutual adversary in Hillary Clinton. She was Giuliani's opponent in his aborted 2000 Senate race, and she'd be Donald Trump's opponent in his 2016 presidential race. Giuliani probably relished the idea of attacking Clinton on the campaign trail for Donald Trump. Would it be out of the realm of possibility to think that, at the time, Rudy Giuliani, a broken man with no direction, saw Hillary Clinton as the representation of his stolen destiny? Getting involved in Donald Trump's campaign would be the opportunity for him to tee off on the person who represented the moment his lifelong dream was shattered. And maybe, just maybe, in the process there would be a silver lining. Working on the Trump campaign was his chance to get back into the national spotlight. Would it get him to be president? No, he surely knew that it wouldn't. But it would get him as close as he possibly could get. He might be able to get a cabinet position. Think about it. Over the past years, Rudy made consulting on security and political issues a big part of his business at Giuliani Partners. He was known throughout the world as being tough on terrorism. He surely believed that he could parlay that experience into being Secretary of State. So he decided to work with the campaign, most likely with an eye on snagging the coveted position of Secretary of State in the event that Donald Trump pulled off an upset. Rudy got heavily involved in the Trump campaign. He was a constant presence on cable news, aggressively defending Trump against criticism and frequently going after his opponent, Hillary Clinton. And as we all know, Donald Trump was surprisingly successful in that race. But while Trump pulled off an upset, it was Rudolph Giuliani who was truly upset. That's because, despite his dedication to the Trump campaign, Rudy was passed over for Secretary of State. After Donald Trump won the presidency, he screwed Rudy. Listen, the reasons that Rudy was passed over for Secretary of State make sense. The optics of his prior consulting for Qatar, Venezuela, and Russia, it was horrible. Plus, his aggressive personality, once an asset, had grown to be seen as a liability, particularly for someone who'd be in a diplomatic position, a position where tact and strategic negotiation are essential. But it still had to sting, given the loyalty that Rudy showed Trump. Regardless, instead of landing the prestigious position of a cabinet member, Rudy was tapped by Trump to serve as an unofficial advisor on cybersecurity. Rudy quietly rejected his consolation prize. There were rumblings that he'd work on some projects, but nothing materialized. Rudy's role silently disappeared, and Rudy left Washington, most likely humiliated. When Donald Trump lost his re-election bid to Joe Biden in 2020, he was pissed. He was convinced that the election was stolen from him, and he was not about to leave Washington, D.C. without a fight. The problem, though, was that he couldn't find anybody who would lead that fight. The allegations that Trump was making about the 2020 elections would not play well in the press. And no reputable lawyer, even if they supported Trump, no reputable lawyer wanted to tarnish their image by getting involved with the case. The major law firms who worked for him in the past, they were all bowing out. So Donald Trump was forced to scrape the bottom of the barrel to find a lawyer who would make his claims. And when he poked his head inside that barrel, there was a dejected, demoralized Rudy Giuliani looking up from the darkness. Once again, Trump extended his hand to Rudy, and once again, Rudy took it. Why would Rudy accept? Tell me something. What the hell else was he going to do? There's nothing more depressing to watch in sports than an aging prize fighter trying to make a comeback. As they lumber into the ring, you can see the wear and tear on their bodies. After speaking to them for just a moment, you can sense the damage that's been done to their brain throughout their long, arduous career. Years of getting pounded leave them with a noticeable fog. When Donald Trump brought on Rudy Giuliani in 2020, he wasn't getting the tough-as-nails former prosecutor who took down the mob and then transformed New York. He was getting a broken, desperate former fighter who was feeling the mental and emotional scars of years of being pummeled in the political ring. Trump was getting an aged fighter with diminished skills who knew full well that there was no hope of regaining his old glory. A fighter whose brain had been scrambled by both years of fighting and, most importantly in Rudy's case, the realization that his lifelong dream of becoming president would never be realized. If there was a question about whether Rudy had lost his mind, it was answered during the months of November and December of 2020 in the affirmative. Rudy went on radio shows and podcasts making a variety of different allegations about the election. He claimed that the 2020 election in Pennsylvania was marred by widespread nationwide voter fraud. He claimed that Democratic officials had orchestrated a scheme to steal the election from Donald Trump, including allegations of fraudulent mail-in ballots and irregularities in vote counting. The claims he made in those venues were bold, but he provided vague support at best for all of them. But that wasn't so much of a problem because he was speaking to the court of public opinion. He made a grave error, however, when he spoke to the actual court. The Trump campaign filed a lawsuit in Pennsylvania federal court alleging campaign fraud. The lawyer who wrote the complaint, that's the document that starts the lawsuit, it's actually called a complaint. The lawyer who wrote the complaint bowed out of the case, like most of the other attorneys who fled the scene. The only person left was Rudy Giuliani. And when the opposition to the lawsuit made a motion to dismiss the case, the only person left to defend the case in court was Rudy Giuliani. But the Rudy who appeared in court that day in November 2020 to engage in the oral argument in defense of the complaint, that man was a shell of the lawyer who once was. He hadn't been to court in years. He didn't write the complaint, so he didn't really understand it. And his appearance in court was a disaster. During the hearing, Rudy admitted that he didn't know what he was talking about. He admitted that he was unfamiliar with the key details of the Pennsylvania election law as well as the specifics of the case. At points, his frustration erupted and he became combative. At times, he clashed with the judge and opposing counsel. But the real problem wasn't Rudy's attitude. It was the critical lawyering error he made. Rudy had no actual proof for the allegations that were made in the complaint. This is a huge no-no for a lawyer. You can go on podcasts and radio shows and make all kinds of allegations without proof. You simply can't do that in the court. Rudy provided no concrete evidence to substantiate the claims during the hearing. Instead, he relied on vague assertions and referenced affidavits from unnamed witnesses, which he didn't even present to the court. There were a few particular issues that stood out. He repeatedly claimed that in Pennsylvania, more absentee ballots came in during the election than were sent out before the election. He said that Pennsylvania sent out only about 1.8 million absentee ballots before the election, but that 2.5 million absentee ballots were counted in the election. The court noted that that simply wasn't true. There was evidence that over 3 million ballots were actually mailed out. Rudy didn't seem to care. He went on to claim that dead people voted in Philadelphia. First, he said 8,000 dead people voted, and then he said it was more like 30,000 dead people. The only proof he had? It was a story about an aged prizefighter. He repeatedly claimed that famous heavyweight boxer Joe Frazier continued to vote years after he was dead. But the evidence actually showed that Pennsylvania formally canceled Frazier's eligibility to vote just after he passed away back in 2012. At the oral argument on that day, Rudy Giuliani made one of the most grave errors a lawyer could make. There was a lack of candor to the court and a lack of evidence presented to the court to support the claims in the lawsuit. Even after losing in court, Rudy didn't stop. He repeated those claims on podcasts, at press conferences, and on his radio show called Uncovering the Truth. He even broadened his claims and went after some election workers. He accused 2 Georgia election workers of committing fraud during the ballot counting in Fulton County. In December of 2020, he promoted a selectively edited video from State Farm Arena claiming that it showed workers engaging in illegal ballot stuffing. According to NBC News, Giuliani accused them of election fraud. He said they had stolen the election with USB drives that they passed around like vials of heroin or cocaine. Rudy Giuliani, the United States Attorney, would never have behaved that way in court. And Rudy Giuliani, the mayor, would never have behaved as he did on the stump for Trump in 2020. But then again, the Rudy that we all saw in 2020 was not the same man we got to know in his earlier years. The Rudy of 2020 was a deluded, defeated man whose defiance turned into disgrace. There can be no better illustration of how far Rudy had fallen than a press conference that occurred late that year. The Trump campaign planned a press conference in Philadelphia at the Four Seasons where Rudy was set to appear to talk about the claims of election fraud. Now, if you had shown up for the press conference at the famous Four Seasons Hotel on Logan Square in Philadelphia, you probably would have been standing next to several members of the press. And you would have all been in the wrong place. The press conference wasn't happening at the prestigious Four Seasons Hotel. The press conference was happening at the Four Seasons Total Landscaping Company. Yeah. No one knows if it was a mistake or just a bit of confusion because of the similar names, but wow. When you got into your car, plugged the Milner Street address into your GPS, and then took the 8-mile drive over to the actual venue, you would have found a podium set up in a dirty parking lot in front of the Four Seasons Total Landscaping Company, an establishment that happened to be wedged between an adult bookstore and a crematorium. And in front of that podium, you would have found Rudolph Giuliani. It didn't matter what he said that day. The picture of him standing at the podium on that gravel-filled parking lot is all you need to envision to appreciate just how far he had fallen. And his fall from grace would become official when he faced the music for his behavior in the courts. The New York courts went after his law license, and the Georgia poll workers sued for defamation. They were both successful. The New York courts took away his law license when they disbarred him from the practice of law, and the courts took away all his money when they found him liable for defamation and issued a judgment of $148 million in favor of the poll workers. Today, Rudy Giuliani pops up every once in a while looking either angry or sad. The last picture I saw of him was on the TMZ website. They got a shot of him in a Walmart, sitting on a mobility scooter, buying hair dye. Thanks for joining me, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the program. Join us next time for a different kind of case altogether. We're going to be talking about lawyer murder. That's right, lawyers murder too. Enjoy the rest of your day.